I was just having a conversation with somebody across the road who's a kind of informal advisor to Nick Clegg. And the point I was making, which is one which, since you're European and under the age of about 60, will chime with none of you, okay? Which is that I was just saying to him I was slightly disappointed that Romney didn't win the US election. Of course, you know, everybody in Europe under the age of about 60 looks as if you're bonkers. But there was a particular reason for this, which I thought there was a 10% chance that Romney could really do something quite radical. And the point he made in response is that the fundamental problem with politics is that each party can do things that the other one can't. So it's impossible for the Conservatives to reform the NHS. Romney could, for example, get rid of lots and lots of tax breaks for the rich and reform the tax system really significantly, which needs to be done. And I would argue probably for the US, and the Americans here who are going to hate me for this, massively increase the tax on gas or petrol, which is far too low in the US, both in terms of the revenue it raises and the environmental effects it has. But there are certain things which would be impossible for Obama to do, which Romney, I thought there was a very slim chance he'd do it, but he at least had the chance to do that kind of thing. And it's one of those interesting things that, you know, the Conservative Party finds it impossible to reform the NHS because nobody trusts them with it. Equally, it's very difficult for the Labour Party to do certain things which are just seen as sort of self-interested and insane, but the Conservative Party can get away with that. And so what I'm saying today, the reason I'm making this point about, you know, who you are affects what you can say, effectively, is that luckily, being a copywriter by background and having spent about 20 years as a creative in advertising creative departments, I'm allowed to say that advertising should be more scientific. Okay. Now, if you have an account man going around like that, or a planner, it is just complete red rag to a bull to anybody in the creative community who will go absolutely bananas and go, this is ridiculous, it's an art, it's all subjective, it's just a question of taste, love, what on earth are you talking about? So my happy accident was having done 20 years stint as a copywriter, I'm allowed to say that. And so it's interesting that the people who are really interested in behavioral economics at first and the earliest adepts weren't actually account men who don't want to go around saying, we need to be more scientific, folks. It was actually people like me and Dave Trott, for example, and certain sort of renegade people in the planning community. Now, what I mean by that is, first of all, to make a very, very important distinction. When creative people or anybody else in advertising says, we need to be more scientific, what they hear about is that, you know, everything needs to be made accountable. And that I'm violently against the idea that marketing should strive to become perfectly accountable. I think, by the way, I think to be scientific, you should be very Darwinian about your marketing, and that you should measure its effects and act on the feedback that measurement provides. But the idea that you should be accountable, in other words, you should be able to say, as a result of doing X, we created value of Y, I don't think is a healthy aspiration. Now, you're going to say, why not? Surely, you know. Now, first of all, there are all sorts of biases with it around measurement, which is you tend to measure and therefore fixate on those metrics which are easy to measure and are numerically expressible. And so the very practice of obsessing about measurement, if you're not careful, can become a kind of distortion. There's a thing called Goodhart's law, which is that every metric that becomes a target loses its value as a metric. Single metrics in particular, for example, click-through, are very dangerous under almost all circumstances. Why are single metrics dangerous? Because you can game them. And people always do. So there's a very interesting question. Talking to Paul Ormerod, the economist, yesterday, we were discussing this very interesting question. Why don't consumers choose more rationally? Okay? Why can't consumers be far more rational? And when they buy a car, why don't they just look at the fuel economy figures and the running cost and then do a cost-benefit analysis, as an accountant would, and end up with the ideal car? And there's a fundamental problem about that, which is that it would be an absolute disaster if everybody did that. And the reason is that if everybody chose a car by how economical it was, what would very quickly happen is car manufacturers would start gaming that metric and produce cars which were extremely economical, but were shit to drive, looked awful, were incredibly uncomfortable, and were possibly dangerous, okay? And were totally uncool, okay? Single metrics are really, really dangerous. So the reason we partly choose as consumers using a brand, which is an aggregate of lots and lots of variables, including social, social comments, the stylishness, your perception of momentum, your perception of. I mean, it's basically a form of data compression, a brand, in which lots and lots of product attributes get fused into one kind of thing. Is that by choosing via brands, we end up with much better products. And when you have a market which is just obsessed by one particular variable, it happens for brief times. Those of you who bought a digital camera sort of 8 years ago can remember there was a period where digital cameras were all about how many megapixels do I get per pound, basically. You know, there was a kind of formula for a digital camera, and people obsessed about the megapixels. Now, arguably, that led to a brief period where the lens quality might have been a bit rubbish, or there were other fundamental flaws in the product. But eventually, also, consumers are quite sane, and they realize that 12 megapixels is kind of good enough for anybody under sane circumstances. Unless I'm taking photographs from the North Korean regime and plastering pictures of Kim Jong-un on apartment building walls at a height of 200 feet, 12 megapixels is basically fine. Okay? And so what happens is, you know, there are periods where people obsess about a particular metric, but generally the law of diminishing returns kick in, and people now choose digital cameras to be absolutely honest on how cool they look, or something else. But the point I'm making is that, first of all, that, you know, that consumers are actually very intelligent in choosing the way they do. Even though it's not rational, it is a much more intelligent way to choose and to ensure themselves of good products than if you have a single metric. If you have a single metric, I'll give you an example. The NHS started measuring the performance of emergency rooms, an A&E, by how long a patient had to wait between being admitted and being treated. So the emergency rooms reacted very quickly and cleverly to this, which is they just kept injured patients in ambulances in the car park until there was a bed free, thereby only admitting them at the last minute and giving themselves absolutely fantastic speed metrics from which they then earn sort of bonuses, praise, and general absolution from criticism. You may notice, by the way, when you ring up for a doctor's appointment, and you say, I'd quite like an appointment on Friday. They go, no, if you want an appointment on Friday, you've got to ring Friday morning before 8 o'clock. That's because doctors are measured by the percentage of patients they see the same day. And if you can't book an appointment in advance, then by definition, you can only be seen the same day. Now, the fact is, to people with a job, that is actually a total pain in the arse. Because it basically means you have to take tomorrow off work in the pathetic hope that the doctor may deign to see you that day, and you have no idea whether to take the morning off, the afternoon off, or anything else. But as far as the metric goes, it makes the doctor look great. So this quest for what you might call creating a kind of perfect Newtonian system out of marketing is not what I mean by being scientific, okay? It's not perfect predictability or absolute accountability. That's an absolutely false hope. Now, let me just explain how stupid, complete accountability for marketing can be, okay? If you have a strong brand, right, the strength of that brand, because of the effect it has on people's decisions, and we use brands as aids in making decisions, in what we'll pay for something or whatever, that brand will affect which people will buy from you, whether it's very mean people or actually quite lavish and generous people. It will affect how much those people, whether mean or lavish, will pay for your product. It will affect how frequently they buy, how loyal they will be, how likely they are to mention you to their friends. It will also affect who will come and work for your business. It will affect how long they stay, and it will affect how much you have to pay them, because people like working for brands. You know, everybody would much prefer to say, my daughter works for British Airways than my daughter works for Ryanair. I'm sorry, but it's true, right? Okay? Let's be absolutely candid about that, okay? It will also affect a whole lot of other things. It will affect your ability to innovate. The nature of your brand affects the kind of new products you can actually create and the degree to which they will be accepted. You know, Ford, to some extent, can produce quite weird cars, like the Car, or the Cougar, or the Focus, which is actually quite an innovative, strange car. And actually, otherwise relatively conservative people will go, well, that car looks a bit weird, but there's probably a good reason for it being weird, because it's from Ford, who are generally quite trustworthy and not basically a bunch of whack jobs when it comes to cars, right? Okay, if Alfa Romeo makes a weird car, then enthusiasts may absolutely love it, but most people in the mainstream market will go, they're just making a weird car to be gratuitously different, and I don't want to look that weird, okay? So it will affect your capacity to innovate, what innovation you can actually produce, what will take from you, what won't take from you. It will also affect unbelievably trivial things like, well, not necessarily trivial, when your chief executive rings up and needs a favor from someone else, whether that person will take the call or pretend to be out. Okay? So that's what a brand affects in terms of a complex system.